jumping ahead on the creating a software solution series of presentations. And really it's just because, again, and we've spent some time talking about this on the periphery. We've had a couple of conversations through a couple other mentor classes about commercial software development and what are some of the things that go on there. I recently did a blog post about it, and I just figured it was a good time. It was a good fit and a little bit of a change of pace from the path we're going down in the Creating a Software Solution series. We wrapped up doing patterns and anti-patterns and sort of on that design area. Figured we'd jump ahead a little bit, sort of to the end, really, and talk about creating commercial software. Now, the thing about commercial software, as opposed to something you're going to use or something that's just for internal usage for a company, is the primary challenge you've got is the software that you're releasing has got to be positioned to be a commercial success. I mean, if it's not, then why do it? Now, this is different from internal. Yes, you want to be successful, but you sort of have you in many ways have a captive audience. It's whoever the employees are at the company. If you have the right political leverage to make sure that that is put in front of everybody, then it's basically going to be accepted. Success is not really up to the to the end users necessarily. Now, in some cases it is, and they can push back and there can be problems, but commercial software is really a different animal in that sense, because you've got people that you're asking them to put up some money to actually pay for it. And although there are software that's out there that's essentially becomes, it shows, people buy it, companies will buy it and it ends up on a shelf and never gets used. For the most part, if you're going to be successful software, you're going to have something that people are going to use. If everybody that buys it puts it on a shelf, at some point, it's pretty much going to tank and disappear. So we want to keep that in mind as we're going through these sort of checklist of some of the things we want to do to make sure that we're actually creating good commercial software. Now, the first things we want to do in thinking about this is walk through what are the considerations for commercial software? What are the things that we need to be thinking about that maybe is a little different? Now it's because we've done our coding, we've done our design, we've done all of our hopefully our market research, and we've put together an application. All right, now we're going to take that step and actually put it out in the market. And so the problems we're going to run into are based on some of these considerations that we need to keep in mind as we're walking through these. First thing is that the people we're selling this to have no idea. They don't have a background on our solution. They weren't part of the development team. You may have beta testers and things like that have been somewhat involved. You may have put some marketing and some buzz out around your product, but at the end of the day, this is going to be new to these people. So especially if you're a developer, solopreneur, you're going to have a way to actually communicate to other people how to use this thing. How does it work? What's its usefulness? How do you walk through it? How do you navigate it? Things like that. You don't have any assumptions that you can work from. Now, on the other side of that, or sort of going hand in that, is there's a set of expectations that customers are going to have for commercial software. If you're just building something for your family, if you're just building something for your local charity, if you're doing something internal, the expectations are not the same as they are for commercial software. If you go and actually buy like shrink wrap software, or if you download from a site that you paid good money to go download that software, and you see them as a, in quotes, professional software development company, there is a set of expectations you have for that software. And so if you're producing commercial software, you're going to have to meet those expectations, or else, even if you've got a good product, you may end up in a situation where it essentially tanks and people aren't happy with it. The good news is that we do have best practices, industry best practices across the board, software development lifecycle, how to develop an enterprise software. All of those things do come into play for commercial software. Those are the things that if you're doing it right, if you're following these best practices, it's going to be easier to get that software out the door. Another thing you've got to consider, though, once it goes out the door, is support and maintenance. if you're doing something for your family, it's just or charity or something like that. It's like, I'll get to it when I get to it. Everybody's sort of casual about stuff because like, well, yeah, this thing's a little bit hokey, but hey, we'll do a workaround. Similar thing, even with internal applications, a lot of times it's going to be your customers are still sort of held at bay a little bit on some of those complaints and bugs and maintenance kind of things, because it's basically going to be, hey, do we want to spend the money to fix this or not? And maybe it's not in the budget. So it's like, okay, it's not really in the budget, so we'll just push it off to a later time, or we'll just put it on a list and it may or may not eventually get taken care of. Commercial software is not the same. You're going to have people, now some people will treat it exactly the same and they'll just be like, it's software, it's not that good, I don't care. But in that group, you're going to have some of them that are going to do that, and they're going to essentially negative sell your product from there on out, because they're not going to complain to you, but they're also going to share their negative experience with other people. You definitely don't want that. If you're going to have anybody has a negative experience, you're always better off to know about it so you can try to address it and try to alleviate that problem. On the other side, you may have some people that they complain about every little thing they find. It's this color is a little off. This pixel is not showing up right. Stuff like that you will run into that in commercial software development. And you're going to have to deal with those people. You can tell them to just go, take a long walk on a short pier, but that's not going to go for very long, and it's not going to win you any converts, and grow your business. So you've got to consider that support and maintenance of your application is part of it. You can't just, there's no such thing as a one and done commercial software. I mean, if you do, you didn't do it right. And it's not, at that point, it's just smoke and mirrors, and you were, fooling people. You weren't actually building software. One other thing that I don't think people consider as often enough is the idea of either investors to come, invest in your product, your company, and take that product to the next level. Buyers that may want to come in and buy your company and your software outright. They want to own all the source and everything. And then also really just general CYA type stuff of, people are out there that are litigious, and they may decide to sue you for something that your software did or did not do. So if you're going to put commercial software out there, you need to make sure you're properly positioned to take care of each of those. So investors and buyers, they need to be able to see that it looks, that what was done is reproducible, that it looks good, that it's, puts a good positive impression across to the customers. And then also, you need to cross your T's and dot your I's so that you're covered in case there is, somebody tries to come after you with a lawsuit or anything like that. And with these expectations that we mentioned that users are going to have, and they have for commercial software, some of it's very simple, but easy to miss. It's things like correct spelling, meaningful messages, things that aren't something went wrong, click OK. That's not a useful message. It needs, and it may not be much better. It may be something went wrong, please contact support, but then you need to have support available for them to contact so they can correct whatever that is. But people that buy commercial software do not expect to see those very often. They're not going to expect to see error messages. And you think about it, when you're using commercial software, you get pretty annoyed if you get error messages. It's one thing if it's like a nag screen or reminder kind of thing. It's like, do you really want to do this? But if it's an error, and especially if it's some, error 5673 data missing or something like that comes up, you're not going to use that application for very long. Similar to that is that there's sort of expectation of bug-free, and not 100% bug-free. I think most people have gotten to the point they realize that, yes, there are bugs or, user errors and things like that. You can't catch everything, but particularly for the most common usages, you want to make sure that those are rock solid, that there's not issues, that they're foolproof. The details that a lot of people miss, and actually years and years ago, I was doing a tutorial. It was part of a consulting company that we did tutorials, and the idea was to do a complete, commercial grade software as part of your tutorial. And there was a guy I was doing one on Delphi. That's how long ago it was. And he was doing it on Smalltalk, which is actually, I'm sorry, it's Power Builder, also, quite a ways back. And that was one of the things that we were talking about these tutorials. And he said, and he'd been a consultant for years and was very, skilled at what he did. And he said, I've been doing these internal applications for years. I never realized how much detail goes into some of this software. And by the details, it was things like, putting tab order, if you've got Windows, putting tab order on the controls so that if people tab through it, it is a logical top to bottom, left to right kind of approach. Making sure that you've got validation on your your controls. If there's tags, like when you mouse over a field or something like that, making sure that those actually have the proper text in them. It's things like that it's all these little finishing touches that often are overlooked, but do make a big difference and are essentially expected in commercial software. Cleaning up your deployment. It's easy for us as developers. We've done all these builds, we've done all these things with our software as we've implemented it. Well, it's not uncommon for us to have like some old, maybe some screens that aren't used, that we've got the files in there. You never see them. The user may never see it, but if you install it, you're going to see these extra files, or maybe there's some readmes, or sometimes we'll leave like SQL scripts will be sitting out there that don't really need to be there. So that's one of the things, is that users don't expect to see a bunch of just frivolous files floating around, because it takes up space, and space may be cheap, but it should look pretty clean. You shouldn't have all these random things floating around, and just consider it as something where a user would possibly look at the folder that you install this in and ask questions about the files. And if any of the answers would be, actually, that doesn't need to be there, we never use it, then you need to make sure that gets cleaned up. Last thing is not really commercial software development, but just in general. Your application should have a consistent look and feel. We've talked about that all the way back when we talked about look and feel and design and clickable demos and those kinds of things. But when you get to the end, you need to sort of, just like you would if you wrote a story, you get to you're going through and you're doing your grammatical and spelling checks and all that kind of stuff. When you get to the end, you're probably going to read it to see, does it flow? Does it make sense? Does it go from page to page, chapter to chapter in a logical manner? Application should be the same thing. It's very easy to have, for example, navigation issues where maybe you saved a link to a page, or you had a quick, a shortcut that you used all the time, but it wasn't really available to a normal user anymore. So now you have navigation that's much more complex than you intended it to be. Maybe there's some buttons that aren't as available as they were, or you've got some stuff you did where they were all there, and then you hit a couple, and now next thing you know, it's really complicated to figure out how to do feature X or Y or Z. So make sure you go back through it, looking for flow, and make sure that it does have a consistent look and feel. And of course, these things, if you go into a beta cycle and have some beta testers, they can help you with a lot of that kind of stuff. The good news, along with best practices, is that we do have tools and solutions to help us through a lot of this stuff. One thing that you really need to have with commercial software, some ability for trouble tickets, ticket tracking, change management, so that you can have a version, a release that goes out, what's in there. There can be complaints against it. So if you're in version 1, you can know that version 1 people complained about A, B, and C. Version 1.1, there's these different bugs that they complained about, and you can fix those based on those versions. Hopefully you'll catch it up so that you won't have old bugs that exist from version 1 to 1.1 to 1.2, but nevertheless you may. So you need to make sure that you have that. With change management, you want to make sure that you've got a good audit, basically a path of what were the changes that were made, when were they made, when should they have been available, because you're going to run into situations where users may install a certain version and say, hey, what do I need to know about this? And you may say, oh, if you install that version, this bug is probably going to bite you, and things like that. Sort of hand in hand with that is a release schedule and planning. You need to be always looking ahead. You have your current version, you've got a bug list, you probably got some new features or enhancements that you want to do. So, share that with the users to, where it makes sense. So they've got an idea of what you're doing and when to expect changes, because particularly if it's any kind of software that they use heavily, and especially if they use it in a production kind of environment, they need to know, when should I expect changes? When should I expect the ability to fix some of these bugs? When should I, plan to have sort of a window of a maintenance window up so that I can actually do an upgrade? Those kinds of things. Customer support and training. This goes back to the idea that your customers do not necessarily know much about your application at all. They may know very little and may not even know where to get started. So you need to have some sort of training, and there's many ways to do this. Go sort of hand in hand to this is application help and documentation, making sure that you've got a way for people from, the moment they buy your application, they know what to do with it, how to install it, how to register, how to get started, how to uninstall it. And, if there's training that's involved, how do they get a hold of training? You should have some training content, somewhere to help with that. And of course, depending on how you set all of this stuff up, you may have a lot of work on your application help and online help. Maybe the documentation is very simple and basically says, look at the application help. Maybe you don't have any application help, and instead you have it very easy to contact customer support, so they can ask your support team that you would have hopefully have spun up how to work with it. Or maybe it's training where it's essentially, we've got minimal help, but we offer some training, so go get yourself trained, and that'll make it much easier to use the application. Pricing and licensing is, you got to get paid for what you're doing. So that's always going to be consideration through all of these kinds of things. Part of your commercial software is, how do you get paid? How often do they have to pay you? That's going to affect all of this stuff, obviously, because depending on if you pay 50 cents for a piece of software, you're going to have very different expectations if you pay $50,000 for a piece of software. Delivery and installation. Up to this point, until you go out to customers, be it beta or a full production, you probably just maybe had a dev server, maybe a test server. You had maybe you're copying files or doing something very simplistic. Maybe you did have some build scripts, but now it's got to work outside of your environment. It's got to work on somebody else's machine. Could be a slightly different. They may have different libraries and different operating system versions and things like that. That you've got to make sure that all of that is, at least a known quantity. Customer contact, as you're rolling stuff out, you can't just, if you just throw something in the App Store, it's not going to just magically suddenly have thousands of downloads. So as part of deploying your commercial software out, you need to be thinking about things like marketing and promotion. How do you tell people? How are you going to do any kinds of deals? Pre and post sales approach, as far as what do we do talking to a customer, how are we going to try to sell them? Are we going to do demos? Are we going to visit them? Are we going to give them free trial periods? Are we going to give them hold their hand initially? Is there something we're going to do afterwards? Are we going to do follow-ups? Are we going to do training? Help them install it? Things like that. All these are customer contact related things that you need to make sure that you have thought through it and put these things in place. And most importantly are the communication channels. How are you going to talk to customers? How are they going to talk to you? Are you going to have an 800 number? Is there an email address? Are there multiple email addresses? Who sees those emails? How do you know that the emails that go to that address are actually going to be worked on? Which again, all this stuff sort of ties together. So it goes back to, okay, well, if I get an email in, does that turn into a change ticket or support ticket, or maybe a ticket out to the sales team, things like that. And now you have to worry about things like, am I going to take in text messages? Am I going to have online, live chat support available? There's things like that. There's a lot of channels available. So you need to figure out, what are you going to support, and probably even what is your primary, because you want to make sure that all your marketing, your promotions, your sales, everybody, you really want to drive everything to that primary channel. Otherwise, it can get very confusing. A change control, dealing with that, if you haven't dealt with it before, it may seem a little daunting, but otherwise it's not that complicated. It's pretty straightforward. For change control, you want to make sure that all changes that go to the system, which means everything that gets rolled out to customers somewhere along the way, you know why you're doing it, whether it's an enhancement or a customer requested it. When did it get done? What version was it done in? Was it tested and how was it tested? All of that should be logged and tracked so you have an audit trail. So you can see from point A to point Z all of the changes that got your software to there. And this is important when you get into things like investment. If investors come in or buyers come in, they're going to look at these kinds of things because they want to make sure that you're not, it's not Wild West out there in your development group. You need to be able to take into account customer feedback, both to feed a bug initially and then, or to feed features and bugs initially. And then also once they go out, in case there's, particularly for enhancements, is some ways that you've got customer feedback so you can see if that enhancement made sense or not. Was it used or not? Is that something we need to explore further, or is it something we need to just, pretend like it never happened, essentially, and maybe even, and sometimes maybe even sunset it or remove it in a future version? With all of this, you need to have a way to do prioritization and set expectations. This goes back to having a release schedule and having well-defined releases. But also within this is figuring out, because we're probably not going to be able to do everything, is essentially, maybe like a ranking of 1 through 5, where all the 1s need to be done and the 2 needs to be done. The 3s maybe, the 4s and 5s probably won't be done. Something like that. Some way so that your development team, your implementers, your implementation group understands what really needs to be focused of any given release or update. And with all that setting expectations is setting expectations for your customers. So if they see, if they enter a bug, it's helping them understand whether that bug's going to be fixed in a couple of weeks or it may be years. Now, with releases, once you get to production commercial software, dates are deadlines. They are not soft targets anymore. If you're an internal application, if you're doing something for your family or the local charity or whatever, you can say, oh, I'm going to get it done. Plan on getting it done the end of the month. Once you go to commercial software, you really need to, if you're going to do it right, you really need to make every date that you set in stone. You just don't miss them, which means you need to make sure that when you set a date, you actually have internally to yourself a date probably in advance of that, days, weeks, maybe months, because you got to make sure that once you've got everything set up to do that release, you still need to give yourself enough time to do all of the tasks around in a release, like updating release notes and maybe updating documentation, printing new manuals if you need to do them, if you have to do some sort of a non-digital delivery, that maybe you need to order CDs and get them burned or put stuff on thumb drives or however you deliver it. All of those things need to be taken into account so that when you set a date that you hit it, because yes, you can miss it and you can survive, but the more often you do that, the more likely it is that it's going to cause you problems. If you're known as, as we set dates and we hit it, it solves a lot of other problems. And it's especially, like I said, with commercial software, it's always good to hit your dates, period. But since people are paying specifically and they do easily have the choice to go somewhere else in most cases, you want to make sure that you do everything you can to make them happy and comfortable with your ability to deliver on your promises. Which is, hands in hand with communicate your release schedule. Make sure that you've got something out there that says, here's the stuff we're working on and we will have it released by, this date. And you can play with those a little bit, particularly further out. So you could say it's, coming in fourth quarter. And it's pretty much become industry standard that if you say like, it's going to come by fourth quarter, it means it's going to, ship December 30 or December 31st, some things like that. So the tighter your date, the more comfort people are going to have and the more impressed they're going to be when you hit it. Make sure with any release, you're going to have release notes and channels of delivery so that you can make sure that anybody that gets that release, whether it's a new version or an update or a fix, that they understand what's in it, What should they expect? Is there any changes in how they work with it? Is there any changes in how it functions? Things like that. And then, of course, what channels you're going to push this through. Is it just going to be part of, is it an auto-updating application? Is it one where they're going to have to go to a download? Are they going to check stuff here periodically? Does the software check like Microsoft Office and some of those things do? All of those kinds of considerations needs to be thought through as part of your releases and your release schedules. Support and training. This is potentially one of the biggest gotchas. It could be very small. If you got simple software, like if it was Doom, or something like that, if it's a game that's very easy to understand, support and training is not that big a deal. If you're putting out a integrated development environment, a development tool, a financial application, something that works with, the medical industry, healthcare industry, stuff like that, some of those things can be huge. And in some cases, your support and training are things like you're selling consulting hours to them as part of doing this. So this needs to be really thought through before you pull the trigger on doing that first release, because you're going to have to make sure that you're going to look at what kind of resources you're going to need, what kind of, is there some staffing that you need to do to get to that point. Part of this is a lot of this going to be decisions. Is this going to be online? Is it going to be offline? Is it going to be real time? Are you going to go face-to-face meetings with them? Are you going to do virtual meetings with them? Is it going to be something where you're going to do a couple of virtual meetings and record them, and then from then on out, people can just, look it up online at any point? All of this, again, goes back to your documentation and online help. Is the more you're going to do offer support and training, the less you really have to rely on online help and documentation. The less support and training you're going to be positioned to do, the better your online help and documentation needs to be. For all of your support and training, document the procedures and make them easily found. So if a user is looking for help and they're wanting support or they're wanting training, if that's something you offer, make it easy for them to find it. If you don't, then it's going to drive them nuts, and they're going to end up just calling random numbers, to get a hold of you or send you emails or things like that. And they're not going to be happy when they get a hold of you. If you drive them to support and they don't have a way to do it, they're going to probably start by cussing you out. If you drive them support and you make it very easy for them to contact support, then that just is going to help you start on the right foot and with the right attitude. Back to pricing and licensing. This is something that this is really more getting into the details of it, of how do you actually do this, as opposed to you need to do it. It's a little more how do you do it. For pricings and licensing, both of those, look at industry standards. Try to find, there's probably some competition out there. Look at how they price stuff. Look at how they position it. Look at how they license it. Now, you may be able to do something that is a competitive advantage. So, for example, maybe they do a one-time fee that's huge, and instead you decide to go with a monthly licensing payment approach where it's not as big a cost because you're getting some of that money up front. Maybe the licensing typically is everybody's forced to do a 3 to 5 year license of the software, and so they're essentially locked in. Maybe you change it around. You say, well, I'm not gonna force you to sign any license. You can turn around and walk away in 30 days, something like that. Obviously, understand the pros and cons of whatever those approaches are. But as far as pricing is concerned, I think it's something we struggle with a lot. All of us do. It seems like it's like way out of control, too high, or way too cheap. So, the things to consider is look at what the industry bears. Look at supply and demand. Is this something that is easily available? And so then you're probably going to do about the same price as it is everywhere else. Is this something that you can't find anywhere else? Is it like, a Cadillac versus a Kia? Then, in that case, maybe, it makes sense to charge more. I mean, look at, a good example is Apple versus, let's say, although Microsoft's not a hardware company, but do look at, if you look at Microsoft with like tablets versus Apple tablets. Well, initially there was a big difference in the prices, but as you see the features sort of match, then the pricing starts to pretty much balance out as well. there's definitely, and no pun intended, you can get to an apples to apples comparison. And you look at things like, longevity as well, supply and demand. Apple did a good job of keeping prices high because what they built was superior stuff. So you were going to be able to utilize it for a longer period of time. And there was also like a feel-good feeling and stuff like that. But, if you think of something more of a commodity, like maybe tires for your car, it's going to make, you're happy you're paying a little more money for tires that are going to last 75,000 miles than those are going to last 60,000 miles. It's things like that you need to consider. And software is more of a challenge like that because it doesn't have as many hard metrics in it. So you're going to have to look to the industry. You're going to have to look to the competitors. You're going to have to look at a little bit at what the, hopefully some customer surveys and things like that to see what the industry will bear. Because if you're charging $10 a pop on, and you should be charging $100, then you should be charging $100. Maybe you can be nice and charge 90, but you definitely want to be closer to the correct price for your software and where you position it. Make sure you provide, you got to consider the payment mechanisms that you're going to use. Maybe you set it up so it's like, the only way they can pay is send you a check. That will turn people away. So you've got to consider that. Or, do you take e-checks? Do you take ACH transactions? Credit cards have become pretty easy and pretty common. You can use like Stripe and stuff like that. But whatever those mechanisms are, take a good look at what the transaction fees are going to be. Whether they're one-time hits or percentage, things like that. It could drastically change what your pricing needs to be and what your margins are on what you're selling. With all of that, you need to have should have a budget. You should have some sort of a target of what kind of how many customers you expect based on those customers. What kind of budget are you going to be going to have? And this is a little bit more of just a practicality than just commercial software, because in general, you need that budget. But for commercial software, even more, because the last thing you want to do is be in a situation where you've got software that's costing you a lot of money to support it, a lot of money to go out there and train and help the users, and you're not making the revenue back. And suddenly you're essentially, you're inverted, and it's essentially costing you money every time you sell a copy of the software. Keep an eye out for beta and early customer discounts. A lot of places do that. It's like hey, we're just getting started. We'll give you, we'll sell this for $100, and later it's going to be $1,000. When you do that later, it's going to turn to $1,000. That's a very difficult step to take. It's a lot better off to price it at $1,000 early on, and then just about offer everybody a huge discount. They think they're getting a deal, even though basically everybody gets that deal. Published price is very important. It sets expectations, and you want to make sure that you follow through with that, and that you set the expectations properly early on, because it is definitely, once you get going, it's hard to increase prices, but there's also a negative view of something if you start dropping your prices dramatically. You almost have to do a relaunch at that point. And just make sure that you're protecting your investment as you're going through this pricing and licensing consideration. Is you want to make sure that it's not super easy for people to pirate it. You want to make sure that it makes sense for people to pay for it, and to continue to pay for it, so that your software that goes out is being used and is going to continue to be used and will continue to hopefully bring revenue in the future. Installation and deployment. Make sure it's well-defined in and out. This is, software has gotten pretty good. If you look at like real commercial software, the companies that do it on a regular basis, the installs and uninstalls have gotten pretty solid. You still have occasional problems here and there, but for the most part, the days where you would install something on Windows and it would leave 15 files behind, and then those would end up having conflicts with other files, with other applications, and the next thing you know, you basically have to format your entire freaking machine just so you can install a couple of pieces of software. Most of that's gotten cleaned up because there is professional stuff like Install Shield and those kinds of applications. I think Install Shield still exists. Those kinds of applications out there that allow you to pretty easily define what the files are that are going to be installed, where they're going to go, and then it just reverses those when you uninstall stuff. And it can even pick up like data directories and even databases and things like that you have push data into or store data at, so that it can clean that up behind if desired. So make sure that you've got that so you know what you're putting on the machine and what you're getting back out of their machine if they uninstall it. This sort of goes to consider is how are you dealing, and this part of it is whether it's a platform, but part of it is how you deliver the software. Is this something where you're going to send them essentially some sort of package, so it's a self-service, they double click on it or click on it, or do something like that where they do the install? Or is it something where maybe they register with you and you push the install to them, or maybe you set up a call and walk them through it? Maybe you actually show up there with with a couple of bags full of software chips or whatever it is that you're installing, and walk through and do it for them. Consider those and how you want to do it, and make sure that it makes sense for you, both you and the customers. Is there some automation that needs to go on with any of this? There should be. The less clicks and questions that users have to answer, the simpler the installation, the happier they're going to be. I don't care if it's Oracle database software. People would much rather be able to essentially like double click, say, okay, yes, I'm going to take the defaults and be done and have it working, than have to spend hours doing, these complex installs. Now that is different from configuration. Yes, there is software that, you install it and then it's going to take you maybe, minutes, hours, or days of configuration to actually get it truly useful. But even then, you want to automate that as much as possible. The less time it takes from a user to go from paying for the software to using the software properly, the better. Target users. Who are you thinking is going to install this? And this isn't really in the case if it's self-service as opposed to registration, because if it's something where you're installing it, then this becomes a non-issue. If something where they're installing it, it is an issue. Is this somebody that's, is it like your mom and dad can do it? Is it something where you're expecting the person on the other end that's installing it to have maybe operating system knowledge, database knowledge? They're going to have to configure a registry somewhere, or they have to go in and edit files. Things like that is make sure you understand who you expect on the other end, and that you're clear with that as part of your installation instructions, because you probably do need to talk to the level of being able to allow your mom and dad to be able to install it. But if not, you need to make sure that those prerequisites are well defined. And finally, this sort of goes back to the whole DLL hell that I mentioned that Microsoft Windows used to get into. Understand, look at your, make sure you know what your libraries, your frameworks, and any other prerequisites that you're dealing with. Make sure you've got those taken care of as part of your install. I don't know how, it's very common, and I don't know how many times I've heard it where it's like a developer says, well, it works on my machine, or it worked on the QA machine, but now that we got to this other one, it doesn't work anymore. Well, it could be simple configuration issues, but it could just as easily be that, maybe, and this happens a lot, the development environment, it happens to under the covers install 3 or 4 libraries or frameworks or jar files or whatever else that's out there that it needs, and you don't really recognize as a developer. You're just off and running. So it runs fine in your development environment, it runs fine in your development machine, because all of those pieces are in place. But as soon as you move somewhere else, those aren't necessarily there anymore, unless they install the development environment on their machine. So make sure you're very that you've essentially done what we used to call a clean install, which was the best you could do. And now that you've got virtual machines and Docker images and things like that, set something up so that you do an install on a machine that's sort of the typical operating system, but has nothing other than the most common software that's out there. Like if it was Windows, maybe it's a Windows machine that has Windows default and like Office on it or something like that. Those kinds of things. So there's nothing else out there, and that will help you determine exactly what libraries or frameworks you need to include so that it's useful to all users. And that brings us to the bottom line. You're putting this software out there, so the most important question is, what would you expect? If you're spending whatever money, whatever price you spent on it, and doing the licensing that you've set up for it, and installing this software and what has been promised, make sure that it meets at least your expectations, preferably exceeds them, so that you look at it and say, yep, I would be happy to have this, which is the next bullet point there. Basically, make sure it's a release you can be proud of. Make sure that this is something that you have buttoned it up, you have thoroughly tested it and vetted it, and you're comfortable with it, that this is going to be useful to your customers, which are the primary reason for this. Make sure that this release is serving your customer. Make sure that what you are getting, what you're giving and what they are getting is of value to them. And of course you're going to provide this value and you're going to price it accordingly, but at the end of the day, it's got to help those customers. It needs to be solving whatever problem is that they want solved. And then, through all of these things that we've highlighted here, basically, is you're looking at risk, reward, and the cost of mitigation. There's a risk if you don't put online help into your application. Now, the reward is that you didn't have to spend as much time to doing it. But what happens if users do suddenly have problems with it? Are you going to have to spend a lot of time on a call? Are you going to have to get on a plane and go fly somewhere to help customers? You need to look at these things and balance them out in a way that you're comfortable with, because otherwise you can end up in a very bad situation where you've got software that you put out there that you have no desire to support or deal with the customers. And yes, customers can be pesky in the best kind of situations. So, there's always going to be those tough times, and there's going to be those tough customers that you wish you didn't have, but you're going to have to deal with them, because hopefully you're going to have some really great customers as well. And at the end of the day, it's got to be valuable to them, but it also has to be valuable to you. If you don't come out of this, earning money for your time and effort, then it's just as big a failure as if they don't. All that being said, 100% correct, 100% done is not necessarily required. There's a lot of products out there that never got out beyond, off the developer machine, basically because somebody just kept on tinkering and tinkering and tinkering and adding they added another little feature and another feature and another feature. You've got to be able to, if you're going to do commercial software, draw a line in the sand. These are some of the requirements. These are the features that I'm definitely going to have. Everything else is nice to have. And when you have those definites done and you're comfortable with them and they work and that covers all of these things, then move ahead. Claim victory, put a flag in the ground, say, oh, done, release, move forward. Particularly with commercial software, because you can always come back and, okay, this is version 1.0. We have these core features. They work. We're good. Version 1.1, we're going to add these other couple of features. And that's why a lot of times you see, 1.0 software often is very buggy. But the other thing is you can typically see very big enhancement moves from version 1 to 1.1 to 1.2 those early releases, because there's all these things that were, the ideas that came up while they were implementing it that they didn't do. They said, okay, well, we can't stop our primary goal of releasing this software, but as soon as we get a chance, we're going to put these other features in because we know they're useful. So, that's something you got to consider is putting that in. And again, with all of these other pieces, if you've got a release schedule, if you've got a roadmap, if you've got your change control and your ticketing system, all that stuff can be in there so that you'll be comfortable that, yes, I've released this today, but I know that a month from now I'm going to do another release and I'm going to have these extra features in there. And it saves you from just constantly going back and saying, oh, no, I got to get this in. Nope, I got to get this in. And it's, your feature bloat and your scope creep just keeps on going and keeps on going, and you never actually cross the finish line. Well, thank you for your time. I do appreciate it greatly. I hope this has been very helpful to you. I hope this maybe opened your eyes or caused you some considerations. Maybe there's some commercial software you use that you suddenly are like, man, this thing really is good, or this thing is really bad, and I'm going to do some complaining. Hopefully this is somewhere along the way made your life a little easier and helped you understand a little bit more how some of those things that if you haven't done commercial software, you probably just would not have crossed your mind. And I don't think any of this is rocket science. It's those kinds of things. It's just not until you sit down and think about it that you're like, oh yeah, we need to do this and this and this. If you have any questions or comments, suggestions, any of that kind of good stuff, you can send an email to info@developerpreneur.com. You can check us out on the website. Comment here. Yeah, check us out on Vimeo. Leave comments on the podcast, wherever you can find us. Feel free to contact us, and we will get back to you on that. Because remember, our goal is to make everybody a better developers. That's just, it's us, you, everybody you know that's a developer, even the ones that aren't. Hey, if everybody gets a little better at it, the world's getting more technical, so it doesn't hurt to have more developers there everywhere. That will do it. Have yourself a good one.
One of the issues I'm running into is like licensing and stuff. I love this presentation. It actually brought a few things to light that I had overlooked. I guess not necessarily intentionally, but they were just so low on my priorities that I think I need to revisit that. But one of the issues I'm running into trying to create the software solution is just dealing with browsers. Themselves seem to be solid, like all the testing kits that are out there that I can integrate with. But the issue that continuously keeps coming up is like Firefox. Firefox in the last 3 releases have pretty much kind of sent the death march that Firefox is not going to be around in the next year or two, because they're just doing everything wrong in respect to developers and testing and websites. Another thing I read today was that a lot of developers are basically now treating Chrome like IE6. So everyone's now developing for one type of browser and not multiple browsers. And it's starting to show up. Sauce Lab's starting to have reports of that. So I'm trying to think, going through this presentation, what kind of approach should I continue to push forward with the software, or should I take a step back and just revisit what the target market is and what I should actually deliver in my first alpha release?
You get into that. I want to be able to address this and this and this and that. And I think platforms, and I didn't really touch on this. I talked about it whenever I did the podcast or the blog. I can't remember what I did. But I remember I did get a little bit into the different platforms before, and I didn't mention it here. I think it's particularly in your situation, it's 1.0 of the software. I think it makes all the sense in the world to have limited platforms that you support. So maybe one or two browsers. If you've got something like, if it truly is where basically everybody's doing it on Chrome, then I would say pick Chrome. Maybe you push Firefox to like the last. So maybe you do like Chrome and IE right now or something like that you support, because you can, it's basically, what do you feel comfortable with that you can test it, that it's going to be stable enough that a month from now your testing's still going to hold. And I think Firefox has put itself in a situation now again, and it did this about a year or two ago, the same kind of thing, where they do this like flurry of releases that do these major changes that essentially break stuff from 2 or 3 weeks ago. And so I think it makes all kinds of sense for you to just say, you know what, I'm going to focus on these couple of platforms. And if you've been talking to some people, so if you know what their platform is, as long as it's not Firefox, hopefully if you can make them lean towards a different way to utilize it, then I would go that route. I think that's your situation where you have a very dangerous possibility of increasing the scope dramatically. And it makes a lot of sense for you to just, maybe take a step back and say, okay, now what am I really providing? What do I really need to support a lot of platforms, or can I pretty much do this, with very limited platforms? Just say, okay, well, if you're going to use this, you're going to have to work within this, within this realm. This is where it works. If you want something else, well, we'll worry about that in a later release. And Firefox in particular may be one where you say, you know what, if we kick that down the road 6 months, it may be a whole different issue in 6 months. It may be that Firefox is pretty much dead and has been absorbed by somebody else, and maybe that there's a whole different group developing it. It may be that they've stabilized. And browsers are like that anyways. Yeah, so if you punt one down the road, you may not ever have to come back to it.
Right, and that's kind of, I'm trying not to increase the scope. In fact, what I've been thinking about doing is shoring up the, like, 4 or 5 core tools within the builder to get it out the door. You know, like you said, maybe just pick Chrome and, you know, IE for the initial support. But I was going to leave all the other features in there and just kind of not say they're there, but, you know, they're there if people want to play with them, but then, you know, announce the official rollout in, like, the next phase.
That's actually a really good way to do it. I'd not mentioned that, but I'm not generally a fan of undocumented features, but in a case like that where you've got something that's mostly there and you think it may prove useful to some people, but you just haven't got the testing, there can be some value in that. That can be useful at times because it's going to allow you to get it out the door faster, to still sort of have that functionality there, particularly if you've got anybody that you know it would be a boon to them. And you can just say, well, this is, caveat emptor. It's basically you can use it, but we haven't spent as much time testing it, so you may run into issues. Now, once you say that, it's like there's still expectations. So if it's got some major issues, that could cause some bad blowback. But
Right.
that may, if you do those and you just have them undocumented, that may not be a bad way to go, because I don't think you may not want to, it may be more trouble it's worth to pull those back out, I guess.
Well, one of the things I thought about doing, and I like how Eclipse does this, if you go to the Eclipse tools page, they tell you what, they're like in 3 stages. There's like a incubation stage, like a beta stage, and then in a final release stage. So I was kind of tempted when I put it all together, put like the features out there, but put, okay, like these features are in incubation, meaning there's no support for them, or minimal support if you encounter bugs, because, it's experimental, essentially. I just wasn't sure how to approach that.
Yeah, I think you're on the right track. You've definitely got some good ideas on how to do it. I think it's just, you're going to have to, it's one of those where it just makes sense for you to sort of sit back and look at what you got and decide which path makes the most sense to you.
How do you define like a software solution? I mean, like in simple terms, like is Micro 2 considered a software solution? Well, as like, and I can give you an example. For instance, like we use Facebook. Can that be considered also a software solution? Or
yeah,
maybe
I don't like. This is I think more of a personal thing than it is. I don't know that this is something that I've done over the last, I don't know, probably 10 years. Because it may be me, it may be my generation. I'm not really sure. That would be something you'd have to sort of see how other people phrase it. Basically, because to me, an application, although you do have web applications, and even then, it's like an application, or whether it's a desktop application or web application, to me I have like a picture in my head of what those things are. They have screens, they have controls, they have, input and output and things like that. There's also that, but then when you get into like software as a solution, if you get into the SaaS type things, I don't tend to think of those as applications as much, because I tend to think of applications as things that, I guess that, for lack of a better term, that I control, where it's like it's on my machine, so I can go, get the data for it, or it's, if it's a web application, it's on my server, so I can go, access the data for it. So I've switched to more, to me, it's like a more generic kind of wording or phrasing would be to call it a solution, because it's really what it is it's, because this covers in whether it's, you may do like just a script, it may be a full-blown application, it may be a web page, it may be, it can be a store procedure. There's things like that. It's basically, how do I use software to solve a problem? So it's how do I build a solution in software that's how I do it. And I don't do that based on like, industry research or, best practices by IBM or somebody's, dictionary of software terms. That's something I've gotten to. So I hope that I've explained, given the definition, how I look at it, but it's, you could go to somebody else and it could